Well, the Swedes were indeed outliers, and a great deal of the book is spent up trying to figure out why that is the case. The Swedish authorities insisted that Swedes were so well behaved that they didn't need to be compelled to follow rules that were necessary elsewhere. Therefore, they didn't close stores and restaurants or schools. They didn't insist on masks. They didn't lock people into their homes. But you could say that the dirty little secret of the Swedish approach was that they were pursuing herd immunity. In other words, they were deliberately allowing the virus to spread through much of the population in order to achieve widespread immunity even before they had a vaccine. Now, no Swedish politician and no Swedish epidemiologist in an official position admits to having done that. But it's clear in retrospect that this is in fact what was the aim. And it's not hard to spot the fatal contradiction at the heart of this strategy, because on the one hand, either you obey the rules voluntarily, and then you don't get widespread infection and herd immunity. But if you do get herd immunity, then you haven't been following the rules. So the question is, which of these two tactics are you in fact following? And that was part of the problem with the Swedish experience, is they never seemed to decide what they were actually doing. And there was a sort of fatal contradiction between the two approaches that they were taking simultaneously. Now, it's very hard, I think, to say why the Swedes went their own way in this respect. If you look at their own historical experiences, you would have expected them to take a quite different approach. If you look at how Sweden tackled cholera or smallpox or AIDS, you would have expected them to clamp down very strictly in much the same way that their fellow Nordics, the Danes, the Finns, and the Norwegians did. The Swedes themselves claimed that they were following the science, but that is simply not true. They ignored lots of the science. They cherry-picked what they wanted. The Swedes weren't alone in doing this. Everyone did this, but they did it too. They were not the ones who were following the science while the rest of us were ignoring it. So, for example, the Swedes argued that Sweden is so sparsely populated that they didn't have to make people wear masks, not even on public transport, because, there's enough distance between people. But then, on the other hand, when they wanted to explain why their results were so much worse than their Scandinavian neighbors, they tended to insist that the countries they should be compared with were not Finland or Denmark or Norway, but instead the Netherlands and Britain, because they too, like Sweden allegedly, had big, densely populated cities. So, you get arguments sort of going in different directions that contradict each other in order to justify a particular tactic that they're using at any given moment. I think that fundamentally, what was motivating this insistence by the Swedes of going off on their own in their own direction was a kind of sense of exceptionalism. Now, every nation thinks that it's exceptional, but the Swedes are exceptionally exceptional, if you want. The Swedes are very used to thinking of themselves as unique. They claim to be the most eco-friendly nation on earth. They claim to be the most gender equal nation on earth. They claim to be the most generous nation in terms of foreign aid. And I think a lot of this sort of sense of why they could do what other nations weren't, and why they could sort of thumb their nose at what was a conventional opinion elsewhere, had to do with this sense that they somehow were not like other nations, and that this wouldn't have the same effect with them. Now, the interesting thing here, and we can come back to this a bit later, is that the Swedish approach that relied on voluntary compliance, in effect, relies also on a sense of implicit monoculturalism. If you want people to adopt certain behaviors voluntarily, it sort of assumes that everyone has been schooled in the same virtues and behaviors, and that everyone can be relied on informally to do the right thing. You don't have to compel them with laws and police enforcement and that sort of thing. So that this idea of this sort of monocultural upbringing, that every Swede had been trained to do the right thing, on the one hand, goes very starkly against another belief that the Swedes have about themselves, which is to say that they are sort of multicultural wonderland who welcome immigrants and who treat them nicely, and therefore, have this multifarious society in which, in theory, unless you've done an awful lot of assimilation very quickly, you shouldn't be able to count on informal behavioral precepts as actually motivating people. So it's hard to have both of these things at the same time. It's hard to have citizens who have been socialized into right-thinking behavior, and on the one hand, and at the same time have as yet assimilated foreigners in large quantities. And yet again, that is precisely a contradiction that the Swedish approach and its contradictions straddled.